I'm not worried about chicken feed availability and prices, but I am paying attention. And I think if you're keeping chickens, you should be paying attention too. Not in a panicky way, but in a thoughtful way. Because the more options you have for feeding your flock, the more flexibility you have when things get expensive or unpredictable. So today we're going to talk about some alternative ways to feed chickens. And I want to be really clear about what I mean by that, because I think there's a lot of fantasy thinking around this topic that doesn't help anyone. The first thing we need to talk about is the chickens themselves. The chickens we keep today are not the chickens of 1850 or even 1950. Even heritage breeds have been selected for higher egg production over the past century. A Victorian-era hen might have laid 60 to 120 eggs a year. Today's heritage breeds are laying 150 to 200 eggs a year. Modern hybrid layers can produce 250 to 320 eggs a year. And every one of those eggs requires specific nutrients: calcium, protein, essential amino acids. You can't cheat biology. Higher production means higher nutritional demands. So when we look at historical feeding practices, we have to remember that those chickens were producing significantly less, which means they needed less. What this means practically is that unless you have several acres of land and you're keeping lower production breeds, you're probably not going to be able to completely feed your flock from what you can grow and forage. And that's okay. That's not really the goal anyway. The goal is flexibility, being able to purchase less feed, having options when feed prices spike or certain products aren't available, building redundancy into your system so you're not entirely dependent on one supply chain. So if you're thinking about where to start with growing food for your chickens, let me tell you about one crop that really makes sense. Pumpkins. We call most winter squash pumpkins here in New Zealand, and I'm just lumping all the squash that stores for a long time into the term pumpkins. If you're only going to grow one thing for your chickens, make it this. Pumpkins are incredibly efficient. The flesh gives your chickens carbohydrates for energy, the center has fat and protein from the seeds, and unlike nuts, chickens can eat pumpkin seeds whole, hull and all. They store through the winter with no processing, just keep them cool and dry and check them regularly for any soft spots. And there's some evidence that pumpkin seeds have anti-parasitic properties. I'm not relying on that instead of proper parasite management, but if it helps, that's a bonus. You want the storage varieties, not the eating varieties. Things like Queensland Blue, butternut, those kinds of pumpkins. These have thicker skins and store better. One good-sized pumpkin will feed a handful of hens for a couple of days. So if you've got space for even half a dozen plants, that's a meaningful contribution to winter feeding. How you feed them matters too. You can split them open and let the chickens just eat at it themselves. They can just go in there and gobble it up, which gives them something to do and takes almost no effort from you, which I love that. I love not having to do too much extra work. Or you can scoop out the flesh and the seeds, and you can process the pumpkin or cook it if you want, which can improve its digestibility for the chickens. Either way works. Pumpkins grow well in most climates. You can find short season varieties that are pretty forgiving, and you get a decent amount of food from the space they take up. So that's a really good starting point. Okay, so you might be wondering if I'm thinking about feed prices or availability, why wouldn't I just reduce my chicken flock or not have chickens at all? If I'm growing all these pumpkins and vegetables, why wouldn't I just eat them myself instead of feeding them to chickens? And the answer is about nutrition, not just calories. If economic pressures continue, I can probably still buy wheat flour, rice, cornmeal, potatoes from the store. Even if prices rise, those staple calories tend to stay available because they're shelf-stable commodities. But the other things, meat, fats, eggs, fresh fruit and vegetables, those are already getting wildly expensive. These are the nutrient-dense foods, and they're the first things that become unaffordable when supply chains tighten or prices start to spike. That's where chickens become strategic. Yes, I could eat those pumpkins myself and get calories, but if I feed them to chickens, along with kitchen scraps, insects, greens, things that don't cost me much, I'm transforming lower value inputs into eggs. And eggs are one of the most nutritionally complete foods that exists. The chickens are doing the work of concentrating nutrition. So maintaining a flock isn't just about having fresh eggs for my breakfast. It's about maintaining access to concentrated, bioavailable protein and nutrients when those foods might otherwise be out of reach. Okay, but let's get back to growing stuff for chickens. Aside from pumpkins, there are lots of options for providing energy to your flock, but what works depends entirely on what grows well for you. Root crops are great. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets. Most of these need to be cooked for chickens to digest them properly. So that's an extra step, but they store well and produce a decent amount of food from a small space. Fruit is another option, and this is very climate dependent. For my location here, plums grow really well with minimal input. Blackberries are almost unstoppable. There are apple orchards everywhere. So while I don't grow apple trees myself, they are very available for free or really cheaply. So it wouldn't be worth growing apples here because I can just walk out pretty much anywhere and get apples. You might have persimmons or figs or something completely different. The principle is the same. Use what thrives in your environment without a lot of fuss. If you want to try growing grains, maize or corn is the most practical on a small scale because the ears are big and easy to harvest by hand. You can grow wheat or oats and cut it as enrichment for your chickens. Throw them the whole stalks and let them scratch through it and eat the grain from the seed heads. But trying to harvest and store small grains by hand is pretty fiddly unless you have specialized equipment. So I wouldn't recommend that for most people. Now, energy is one thing. Protein is where this gets tricky. This is the limiting factor. You can't just skip protein, and it's the hardest thing to produce on a small scale. If you have space for free-ranging, insects are your best bet, especially in spring and summer when bug populations are high. Chickens are really good at finding insects if they have access to the ground. And if you're managing your space well, encouraging insect populations through habitat and plant diversity, that can make a real difference. If you're set up for it, insect farming can work. Worm farms are probably the most accessible option. You can start with a basic bin system, feed them kitchen scraps and paper waste, and they'll produce both worms for your chickens and worm compost for your garden. The chickens don't need many worms to get a protein boost. Just a handful per bird goes a long way. Black soldier fly systems are more intensive but really productive if you're in the right climate. They need warmth to thrive, so that's more practical in some places than others. Mealworms are easy to set up and good for treats, but it's hard to produce enough volume to make a real dent in protein requirements unless you're running a fairly large operation. The key with any of these things is starting small and learning how they work before you're depending on them. These systems have their own rhythms and requirements. Historically, people with dairy animals fed their chickens whey and skim milk, which are excellent protein sources. That's not practical for most of us today, but if you do have access to dairy products that would otherwise go to waste, chickens can use them. Nuts are another great option if you have trees nearby or can forage them. Walnuts, hazelnuts, acorns if you have oak trees. I've planted 4 hazelnut trees here in my backyard. I've got one right next to me here. It's one of my little hazelnut trees. Nuts provide both protein and fat. The issue is chickens can't crack whole nuts. The easiest solution is put them in a feed sack or old Hessian bag, lay it on your driveway, and drive over it a few times with your car. It breaks up the nuts perfectly, and the chickens can get at the nut meat inside. But I want to be honest. This is where most people, including me, still need to purchase either complete feed or protein supplements like blood and bone meal. Growing enough protein for a flock is really challenging unless you have extensive space or very sophisticated systems. Growing greens for your chickens is pretty much the easiest category to sort of get ticked off. Whatever brassicas grow well for you, like kale, bok choy, cabbage is a really good one, although mature cabbage often needs cooking for chickens to be able to eat all of it. Growing lettuces, these all grow quite well even in cooler months if you've got a mild climate. My chickens love silver beet, which is also called Swiss chard. Silver beet grows really well in most seasons and actually produces a decent root underneath once the green part is finished, which you can cook and feed to your flock. If you have space for pasture management, growing a diverse mix of grasses and legumes that you keep mowed at a high point so it stays young and actively growing, that's a great way to add nutrition. Chickens can eat quite a lot of fresh young grass. I've just done a video all about pasture management for your chicken flock, so you can check that out if that's an option for you. And then there are forage plants you can establish. Things like comfrey, chicory, plantain. These are pretty tough once they're established and can provide greens with minimal maintenance. Kitchen scraps fit in here too, and if you've got neighbors who don't have chickens, maybe they can give you their scraps in exchange for a few eggs. Vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, plate scrapings, that sort of thing can make up a decent portion of your flock's diet without any extra effort on your part. Just be careful about how much processed food might end up as kitchen scraps. White bread and packaged food isn't healthy for us or for our chicken flocks. One thing to keep in mind is seasonal variability. Crops only grow during their specific growing season. It's only really greens that can grow all year round. And if you get snow or hard freezes during your winter, not much is going to be growing for you then. So if you're serious about this, you need to think about storage. What crops store well? Pumpkins, root vegetables, things like that. Can you freeze excess greens or fruit? I sometimes freeze bags of produce scraps and summer squash through the abundant months to use in winter. Can you preserve things in other ways? Dehydrating or fermenting vegetables makes them more digestible for chickens and extends their life. They're also pretty tasty for people too. And then there's planning ahead. If you know winter is going to be lean, you need to be planting storage crops in spring and summer, so you've got them on hand when fresh growth isn't available. It's about thinking a season or two ahead. You also want to pay attention to what grows easily in your shoulder seasons, those in-between times. In my climate, brassicas and lettuces grow really well in spring and autumn and can extend fresh greens availability quite a bit if you plan for it. The reality is that even with good systems in place, even with foraging and homegrown feeds and insect production, you're probably still looking at purchasing at least half of your flock's diet, maybe more. But that's still significant. That's flexibility. That's having options when one feed is unavailable or too expensive. That's being able to fall back on alternatives when you need to. And the time to build these systems is now, not when you actually need them. Fruit and nut trees take years to establish. Worm farms need time to build up population. Learning what grows well in your space and your climate takes experimentation. So start somewhere. Maybe that's just planting a few pumpkins this season. Maybe it's setting up a simple worm bin. Maybe it's paying attention to what fruit trees thrive in your area and putting one in the ground. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to achieve complete independence. You just need to build some flexibility into your system. Because flexibility gives you options, and that is a very valuable thing to have.